Welcome everyone to our second Facebook live stream event. Today we will be discussing a topic of great interest to the stuttering community, research. Each time we post an update on stuttering research on our website, stutteringhelp.org, that's H-E-L-P, stutteringhelp.org, or on our social channels like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn, we see our engagement levels soar. Before we meet Dr. Drayna, Jane, let's start with a few questions for you. For more than 70 years, the Stuttering Foundation has been providing trusted information about stuttering. Can you tell us what you offer and where you might find it?
Well, thank you, Greg. You know, you've already let folks know where a lot of material is. It's at our website, stutteringhelp.org. But obviously, when we first started out, we didn't have the advantage of having an internet. So we began by publishing books. And as of today, we have 38 different books on stuttering. And I'd like to add that they can be found in 16,072 libraries across the country. That's a long-term effort that we made because, quite frankly, because we didn't have an internet. And we thought, well, if someone stutters and they don't know where to go, the public library is the place they're going to go. In addition to that, our streaming videos, now we have 105 streaming videos online. We have more than 5,000 students using our continuing education credits, our continuing education materials. We run virtual learning webinars and podcasts, and have free books and brochures, all at stutteringhelp.org. In addition, we have translations of many of our books. Our books have been translated into 36 languages, and we just heard from someone today from Tanzania. We were able to connect him with a young man in Rwanda and another therapist in Lagos, Nigeria. So all of that in one morning. The outreach is amazing.
That's wonderful. Jane, can you tell us a little bit about how you met Dr. Drayna?
Well, I was on the council of the National Institutes of Deafness and Other Disorders, which is hard to say, part of the NIH. I was asked to join that council in 1996, and I always thought it was because I knew so much about stuttering, but that was not it at all. I found out afterwards that Dr. Earlene Elkins, who had recommended me because of management skills. So I spent many years on that council not knowing why I was on it. But I enjoyed it, and I met Dr. Drayna. And obviously, I was very interested in meeting any of the scientists who were specifically looking at stuttering in any way.
Well, Jane, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time to meet our special guest. Dennis Drayna, Ph.D., is a Stuttering Foundation Board member and Scientist Emeritus at the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Drayna received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin in 1976 and his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1981. He did postdoctoral research in human genetics at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute at the University of Utah. In 1996, Dr. Drayna joined the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders within the NIH. His research interests are focused on applying the tools of human genetics and genomics to a range of topics that span the mission of the Institute, including disorders of auditory pitch perception, variation in the sense of taste, and disorders of speech and language. In 2010, Dr. Drayna uncovered the first genetic basis of stuttering in humans. Since the initial discovery, he has expanded the understanding of genetic and neurological causes of human stuttering, including discovering additional genes that cause stuttering and creating animal models that allow detailed brain studies. It sounds like you've been an active leader in the stuttering research community for quite some time. Welcome, Dennis.
Well, thank you very much. I want to give my thanks to you and the Stuttering Foundation. One of my favorite organizations, for the opportunity to join you today.
Wonderful. Maybe we should start with just a brief history on the type of research that you've conducted to learn about stuttering.
Sure. Well, I'm a geneticist, a human geneticist in particular, and over the course of my career, I have, in the distant past, worked on a wide variety of human genetic disorders. But in the past 20-some years, the largest single focus of my work has been on stuttering. The reason a genetic approach to stuttering is attractive is because the genetic approach is remarkably agnostic. And by that, I mean, unlike most fields of scientific inquiry, where you need some sort of hypothesis, you need some sort of guess what's wrong in the disorder to begin to probe and to sort of look to better understand that disorder. Genetics doesn't need that. Genetics doesn't really care in that sense about what the underlying pathology, the underlying mechanism of the disorder is. Genetics is almost uniquely powerful in its ability to get down to understanding the cause of really any disorder, as long as it's genetic, all the way down to the level of cells and even molecules in the body in sort of one giant leap. So genetics is very powerful and ideally suited for something like stuttering that is awfully hard to approach from other methods. People who stutter, it's difficult it can only be studied in awake behaving individuals. And we don't really we never had a very good idea of the underlying scientific aspects of the disorder, what might be called the biochemistry of the disorder, or the pathology of the disorder, or the physiology of the disorder, or the cell biology of the disorder. So this was really sort of a terra incognita. It was just a big black box, but genetics did provide an approach that could maybe work to better understand that kind of a disorder.
Wonderful. I know there's been a great deal of research done. What are some of the most promising recent studies and what have they uncovered?
Well, I think I'll start answering that by just noting how surprised we've been at the discoveries we've made. The genes we found, the genes that cause stuttering, and I think I just need to sort of clarify at the outset here, there are likely to be lots of genes. Speech and the production of fluent speech is a pretty complicated process. There are almost certainly lots and lots of genes, the proper function of which is needed to produce fluent speech. But to give you just some context here, in my institute at the NIH, there are people who study the genetics of deafness, hearing loss. Right now, we have something like 120 genes that are known to be necessary for proper hearing. So far in stuttering, we found a total of 5. And I think it's clear that we still have a ways to go. But amazingly, all 5 of the genes we found so far all seem to be sort of part of the same business. And given the fact that the genetic approach is really not only agnostic, but the genetic approach doesn't really stack the deck, so to speak. You don't know what the gene you're chasing is going to code for. You don't know what the function of that gene is going to be until you actually lay your hands on it. But amazingly, all of these genes that we found so far all function in the same business. So we have a function inside cells. This function is what's called intracellular trafficking, that is moving things around inside cells. Now, why is this important for a neurologic disorder or neurologic disorders in general? We think it's because nerve cells, otherwise known as neurons, are physically so different from all the other cell types in the body. So these disorders of intracellular trafficking are now becoming more and more recognized in clinical medicine and in genetics. And they're all neurological. They're all primarily present as a problem with the nervous system, the brain, the nervous system. Well, nerve cells are unique in the body in that they're a very different size and shape than all the other cells in the body. Most of the cells in the body, like the liver cells or the muscle cells or the heart cells or the bone cells, you name it, tend to be very, very small. They're at most maybe 100 microns, which is 1/10 the thickness of a dime in diameter. Nerve cells can be feet in length. Many neurons in the brain are 3, 4, 5 inches long. And a cell that's that long and that extended obviously has tremendous demands for moving things around into the right places in the cell. And so deficits in the moving things around process seem to preferentially attract nerve cells, neurons, and preferentially cause nervous system diseases. So those are what we found so far in stuttering. And I think the more remarkable, the more fortunate situation is that once we have genes that are pretty convincingly causative of stuttering, then we can do a lot. Then we're no longer in the agnostic business. Then we have a mechanism that we can start teasing apart. We can attack specifically and learn in much more detail about what's going on in the brains of people who stutter. So to that end, we decided to do something wild, something that you could probably only do at a place like the NIH, which I need to give a shout out to here because of their remarkable research capacities and the remarkable infrastructure that organization has for biomedical research. But we decided we would try and make an animal model of stuttering. Now, I think all of the people listening can recognize that there's a problem here in that animals don't talk. But our view of stuttering is a little different, maybe. When I personally first learned about stuttering, I was struck by what's not wrong with the speech of people who stutter. People who stutter don't have problems with memory or sort of word, sometimes called word finding. They don't have problems with grammar. They don't have problems with syntax. They don't have an articulation disorder. They don't have a problem with pronouncing words. What they have a problem with is they have a problem in the smooth production of speech that is in other respects really quite normal. So, of course, lots of animals produce vocal communication, some of it actually quite sophisticated. And so while we clearly couldn't make a model of human speech, that's just not realistic. The question was, could we make a model of what we call the voluntary control of vocalization? Because that seems to be a major problem in stuttering. People who stutter, they know exactly what they want to say. They just don't seem to be able to say it at the rate they would like to, okay? So maybe you could get an animal model for that. And so we took advantage of the laboratory mouse, which has extremely sophisticated vocal communication, most of which we can't hear because it's too high. It's what's called ultrasonic. It's above the range of human hearing. And they have very rich vocal communication. So we started with just the first common human stuttering mutation that we found in populations of a South Asian ancestry. The mutation was originally found in Pakistan, but we subsequently found that same mutation in people who stutter from India and their descendants in the United States whose ancestors came from Pakistan and India who stutter. And so we put that one single mutation into a mouse, and we started looking at the vocalizations of that mouse. And most of the vocalization of that mouse was fine. It was perfectly normal. And everything else we could test about that mouse was perfectly normal, except for one thing. The vocalizations of those mice had gaps and pauses and interruptions that genetically normal litter mates, so the siblings of the mice that carried that mutation, who themselves didn't have that mutation, didn't have, okay? So just a single is really quite remarkable. Just changing one letter of the genetic code in the mouse genome to the letter that was present in the humans who stutter, okay? This is one letter out of 3 billion, all right?
Wow.
Was enough to change the vocalization of mice, which of course we can't hear. The only way we knew this was we used specialized recording equipment. And then we humans did not evaluate the vocalizations of the mouse. This was all done by computer. So there's no sort of human judgment involved in the individual mouse recordings. But we actually also showed that if you take the speech of humans who carry that same mutation and you give it to that same computer program, it finds the exact same problem, okay? So it appears that you can actually kind of make a mouse stutter, okay, with quotation marks around stutter, because mice don't really talk, of course. But if you have a mouse that displays a disorder in their vocalization, the door has now been flung wide open, okay? Now you can do all sorts of things with that mouse that you could never do in a human, right? And that, I think, has been the most exciting recent things we've done. So we have worked hard to look at the brains of those mice. A postdoctoral fellow in my lab, Dr. Taeyun Han. Dr. Han looked at every tissue there was in those mice, and he didn't find anything. And he looked and he looked and he looked. And we sent the mice to a research pathologist, and he looked and he looked and he looked, and we couldn't find anything. And I was quite frustrated at that point. And Dr. Han said, no, we're not quitting. I want to try something else. So he started staining different types of cells in the brains of our stuttering mice. All right. And so he had stains. There are stains for different types of cells. The brain has many different types of cells. We don't even know how many different types in humans yet. It's been estimated that there might be a couple hundred different cell types in our brains. But there are stains that identify some specific ones. And so he tried a stain, no difference. He tried another stain, no difference. Another one, no differences, until finally he tried a stain for a type of cell called astrocytes. And there he got a difference like gangbusters. So astrocytes are a cell type in the brain. The people who discovered them thought they looked like stars under the microscope, so they named them astrocytes. They're small cells with lots and lots of star-like projections in the brain. So it turns out that the most recent results we have do suggest that astrocytes are a cellular site, a common cellular cause of stuttering in the brain, which is not something that I think could have been arrived at by other scientific approaches at this time. So I think getting a cellular cause for stuttering in the brain is probably one of the most exciting things we've done.
And those astrocytes can be found where? Are they in the white matter of the brain?
Well, astrocytes are pretty widely distributed, but they are especially distributed in the white matter. Now, the brain has two general kinds of tissue. It has the gray matter and the white matter. And that you can just see with your eye. If you look at a human brain or a slice of a human brain, it clearly has these sort of layers that are gray and other areas that are white. The gray part is the cell bodies. That's what they do the computation. They're like the little silicon, ones and zeros in a computer chip. They're all connected by cables. That's the white matter. Okay, these long processes that come out from these neurons bundle together as cables, sort of, you can think of in the brain. And that's the white matter. And astrocytes are especially rich in white matter. They're in a class of cells, they're not electrically active. They're not neurons. They're viewed as a supporting cast. The brain has two general types of cells, neurons and glia. Glia is the German word for glue. They kind of hold everything together. But glia provides support for the electrically active neurons that sort of can be thought of as doing the computation that our brain does, all the processing that's needed to be done. And the supporting actors sort of help them live, help them thrive, help them transmit signals across white matter cables to various regions of the brain. So that's what astrocytes do, among other things. And I'll just say that I don't want to minimize or in any way dismiss brain imaging study, because there are literally dozens of brain imaging studies of stuttering using all different types of imaging technology. These technologies are becoming more and more sophisticated. They are learning more and more. Imaging technologies cannot see at the level of cells. Imaging technologies can get down in resolution to about 1 millimeter, so that's about the thickness of a dime. Well, there are many cells in 1 cubic millimeter of the brain. Many cells, lots of different kinds of cells. So that being able to tell what type of cell it is beyond the current resolution ability of imaging. So while I think imaging has been very useful, and I think will continue to be useful in studies of stuttering, I think these sorts of genetic approaches are they give us another view of the neurons in the brain that is pretty much impossible to get by any other method at this point.
Very interesting. So you've mentioned genetics, you've talked about the brain. Maybe this is a good time for you to talk about what are the factors that contribute to stuttering?
Right. So that, Greg, is a very good and very important question, because what we see, what people experience as stuttering is a very complex phenomenon. So the formal kind of medical definition of stuttering is repetitions, prolongations,
blockages.
And blocks, that is, interruptions in the otherwise smooth flow of speech. Now, there are different opinions. I think perfectly good experts differ, I think, in their opinions about which of those different things is primary, that is, which causes the others. There is a lot of thought that it's the block that's sort of the primary problem. The people who stutter, they know exactly what they want to say. They can, once they get going, they can say it just fine, but there's this interruption in their ability to continuously flow their speech. And that, many people think, and I tend to agree with them, produces these other things, the prolongations and the repetitions, as an attempt to overcome this block, okay? So if really the block is primary, it can kind of be obscured by these other behaviors that people who stutter have. And the other big important thing that we still really don't understand, and we don't really even have a good genetic entree to, is anxiety. So I don't stutter, but I have learned many things about stuttering from the stuttering community, to whom I owe a great debt for patiently leading me through the realities of their disorder. But the people who you can take a person with a relatively mild stutter and turn them into a person with a moderate to a severe stutter if you just provide enough stress. You can take a mild, like I like to say, you can take a mild stutter and turn it into a severe stutter by just asking the person to give an off-the-cuff live speech to an audience of 500 people. We don't understand why anxiety tends to make stuttering worse, much worse. Sometimes anxiety moves stuttering from a position where it's not even visible to an independent observer. I mean, the person who stutters, who's speaking, of course, they can feel it inside, but sometimes those of us outside don't even know it in mild cases. And if you give them enough stress or anxiety, they will suddenly begin to stutter at a level that it will become noticeable. So in that sense, anxiety looks like it's causing stuttering, but that itself doesn't seem as likely, at least to me. And my sort of not very well informed scientific opinion on this is there's lots of anxiety in the world. The world is full of people put in stressful situations and they don't stutter. Okay? If anxiety itself caused stuttering, you would see it more broadly anytime people had anxiety. Just the general population had anxiety. So that's why I don't think anxiety is primary. Now, as a scientist, I'll just say, interested in animals and animal vocalization, I'll just say that there is a connection between anxiety and vocalization in the animal world. If you just go and look, much vocalization in animals has to do with situations where the animal is worried about something. You know, your dog barks. Your dog usually barks to say, or at least our dog usually bark, not because they're themselves being aggressive, or they bark to say, come here, there's something I'm worried about, come look at it. You know, you hear that in dogs. In monkeys and howler monkeys in South America, people study their vocalizations, and the real experts in this have found a monkey call for danger on the ground, okay? And as they listened more and more and more and did more and more careful analyses, there are two versions of this call. One of them is danger on the ground jaguar, and the other is danger on the ground snake. So it's clear that vocalization and anxiety have been somehow connected throughout millions of years of evolution. And I think that's what we're still seeing in humans today.
And Dennis, you know, in quotes, normal speakers with no stuttering, if you ask them to stand up and give a speech in front of 500 people, they may have a great deal of difficulty. They may not stutter, but certainly their vocalizations are not going to be anything like they would in a different situation, are they? No.
It's a very unusual person that can just step up in front of 500 people and enjoy giving some off-the-cuff remarks. So I think, yeah. So I think that is one thing. I think that's one thing we don't yet understand very well. But there's some other new things that we have not yet published that I find very exciting. They're kind of they're sort of unifying. Now, let me explain. Genetics does not explain all of stuttering. In the genes, the 5 genes we found so far, if you just take random unrelated people who stutter, okay, sort of, you know, to just say, just people who stutter off the street, and you look at the 5 genes that we found so far, you can find a mutation in one of these 5 genes in something like 20% of them, maybe a little more, maybe. So, you know, the optimist view of this is that we have found the cause of a significant chunk of stuttering in just the general stuttering population. The pessimist view, of course, is that there's 80% that we still haven't explained. And some of that is genetic. And it might be, as I've said previously, it might be lots of different genes, each contributing a little bit. And I think that might be a likely hypothesis at this point. But even if you find something that causes very few cases, it can be incredibly enlightening. So let me give you an example. So in work that we haven't yet published, we had a family, a very large family from Pakistan with many, many cases of stuttering. And in Pakistan, there are a lot of cousin marriages because of religious and cultural tradition. And so you can find lots of big families with many cases of stuttering. So one such family we knew in this family years ago, by our genetic studies, we knew there was a gene on chromosome 3 that caused stuttering in this family. And we even had a candidate because in that little region on chromosome 3, Dr. Hashim Raza, who's now a professor at the University of Kansas, Hashim found a mutation in a gene, and we just, well, maybe to apply blame where it needs to go, I just dismissed it. And it was because it didn't look like much of a mutation. It really, it looked very mild. It didn't seem to change the gene very much, or the gene product. And so we went out and we sequenced this gene in 1,000 people, unrelated people who stutter, okay? We didn't find any other mutations in this gene, none. And I thought, forget it. This is some sort of fluke, okay? Well, it wasn't until years later, as somehow typically, not typically, but often, too often happens in my lab, another smart person with a good pair of eyes was looking at this data years later. Steve Boyden, who's now at the University of Utah in genetics there, said, you know, that change in this gene, if you look at all the other species in the world who have this gene, and it's all the other species in the world have this gene, it's evolutionarily ancient, it's an important gene. There are no differences at that spot. Every single organism in the world, and there are something like hundreds of genome sequences, so we know the sequence of this gene in hundreds of different species, and they all have, at that position, the same thing that the normal humans have. So evolution doesn't like to change that position in the gene. And if you start putting it into automated prediction programs for the effects of mutations, this one comes off with flashing lights. It's like, this is likely damaging. So we put, so let me tell you about that gene. So it's a gene called ZBTB20. So what is that? Well, it's a member of a big gene family. There are 20 members of the family, more than 20 actually. It's the 20th that was found. And these things are called transcription factors. So what is a transcription factor? So to answer that question, I'll just digress to a little story. A great question in biology is, every cell in our body has the same DNA. So why is a skin cell so different than a bone cell, so different than a blood cell? All right, and the answer is, which of those genes, the 20,000 genes in every cell in our body, which are turned on and which are turned off? Okay, so the process of turning on a gene is done through a cellular process inside the cell called transcription. You're reading the gene, you're transcribing the gene into the gene product. Okay, so what determines what genes are transcribed in a particular cell and not transcribed? Well, it's transcription factors. Okay, so what is ZBTB20 is a transcription factor, and so what does ZBTB20 control the transcription of? Well, it controls what's called a developmental program, the creation of different cell types very early in the development of the organism. Because, you know, when we just start with a single cell, and as we grow, all sorts of different cell types appear during development. Okay, what cell type does ZBTB20 control? Astrocytes. It's the transcription. It is the primary transcription factor responsible for the development of astrocytes. So,
and you know, if you had found that first, if you had found that it controlled astrocytes first, but hadn't done the other research in the order that you did, you wouldn't have made the connection as much, would you?
It would have been a long shot, let's put it that way. Although I must say, the connection of just finding by staining different cell types was the hard way to do it. and it wasn't because of the dogged persistence of Dr. Hahn. I don't think it ever would have happened, to be perfectly honest. That guy is really something. But anyway.
Dr. Drayna.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I want to make sure we leave a little time here to answer some of the questions. And being 40 minutes in, I did want to give you a chance to answer a question, which, Jane, I'm sure you would tell us you get this at least once a week, if not more frequently. People ask about, is there a cure for stuttering? And so I think the natural question to ask a researcher is it possible that stuttering research can lead to a cure or better treatment, a better process moving forward? And I think people would love to get your take on that.
Sure. Well, the word cure is always a loaded and kind of difficult term. People talk about a cure for cancer, but as many people who've unfortunately been afflicted with cancer know, cure is a very relative term. I think the question is, can we use research knowledge to make better treatments for stuttering? And I should tell you, I came to the NIH following many years in the pharmaceutical industry, and I know what the pharmaceutical industry looks for to start a drug development program. And what they look for is they look for molecules. They look for causes of the disease at the level of molecules. And I think this issue of intracellular trafficking has begun to attract the attention of pharmaceutical companies, because so many different neurological disorders have this as the primary deficit underlying all those disorders. It's problems with trafficking. So I think as pharmaceutical companies begin to get better information about these causes of stuttering, I think personally, I'm hopeful that that while stuttering itself is not considered to be a big enough market to launch a very large pharmaceutical research program, development program into, all these other neurological diseases are, okay? And the idea that that something that affected this process was a new therapeutic that corrected problems in intracellular trafficking, the idea that this would float all boats and that stuttering might someday be able to come along with that. So I'm encouraged about that prospect. I think I just want to say to everyone who's listening that the distance between basic laboratory research and a therapeutic, a pill you can swallow, is large and the process is long. So even the most exciting and biggest developments in research are not going to result in a cure for stuttering in the next year. But I think increasing the general body of knowledge about stuttering is what's most needed to ultimately improve therapies for the disorder.
Thank you so much. And Jane, I know the Stuttering Foundation does a good job of putting out the publication of the most recent research, and maybe just talk a little bit about how both on the website and the magazine are a place we can find things like that.
Well, the magazine now reaches more than 105,000 people, which is larger than a lot of city newspapers, with going to schools throughout the country. We hope there are going to be schools opening at some point, and that if we can't reach them physically, we can reach them through the internet. But promoting a research, bringing school speech pathologists and other therapists throughout the country up to date on what's being done is really important. And I think, as Dennis said, well, I think hope, bringing hope to people, I think the more whether it's cancer, whether it's heart disease, the more you know about a problem, the more in control of it you are. And so that's certainly one of our goals, is to educate people so that they know they're able to choose, for example, why speech therapy, knowing what their goal for therapy is. Is their goal being able to raise their hand in class and ask the questions they want? Is their goal to get a job? Is their goal? So, focusing on what their needs are in therapy and teaching them how to go after those goals, what questions to ask if they're choosing a therapist. Those are all areas that we're interested in and hoping to improve people's lives in a very practical way, in a way that helps them immediately. Because, as you've heard from Dennis, it's a long way from an astrocyte to a cure. But at the same time, knowing these parts, these cells and interesting features that are part of the causality is certainly, I think, reassuring. It's like what's happening in the cell with cancer. It doesn't seem so distant and scary once you understand what's happening on the cellular level, I think.
And if I could just butt in, if I
Please.
might, I personally think that it's important for people to realize that stuttering is not their fault. It's that there are mechanisms that are fundamentally in the nature of biology that are beyond their control that lead to this condition, and to take some of the self-blame
Yes.
off of this problem.
Yes.
It's no different than if I had if I had some inherited problem that I had fingers that were joined together, sometimes called syndactyly, a hand malformation. It just is no more that person's problem than syndactyly is to the people who have that. And so removing self-blame, I think, is an important component as we begin to understand these causes.
Oh, yes. And, that was one of the big points we made in 2010 when you discovered the first 3 genes. I think one of the most important things then was all sorts of people wrote us and said, now we realize it isn't my fault. It isn't our fault. And that was, I think, for most people, a huge revelation. And the other thing, of course, that we seek to let parents know that they have not caused stuttering in their child.
Oh, yeah.
Because there again is a heavy burden of guilt that they carry. What did I do? And also, you think about it, if you think you caused it, then everything you do all day long is under that kind of tremendous pressure. So you've got to release that and just focus on your child and something other than this guilt that you've been carrying. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Dennis. Very important. And that's and in that same light, I think talking openly about stuttering, walking into a job interview now and saying, I'm a person who stutters. I think I can do a good job for this company, whatever. But up front, first day of school, same thing. I'm a kid. I'm in 4th grade now. I stutter sometimes. I used to go around the room and tell the other students who you are and your name. Boy, get it out there on day 1, because that lifts all that burden.
Yeah.
I do have a question here. It's a little bit technical, so I'm going to read it as it's written and give it to Dr. Drayna. So the question is, so if the transcription factor you mentioned helps produce the DNA that creates astrocytes, have any studies been done to introduce an enzymatic transcription inhibitor to these strands so that it would target this general transcription factor and possibly eliminate the DNA needed to create these astrocytes in the first place?
Right. So that's a pretty good idea, actually. And in fact, there are companies who are taking that approach to solving a number of different diseases. So the shorter answer is, of course, we don't have that. The problem is ZBTB20 is not uncommon among transcription factor in that astrocytes isn't the only thing it controls. So if we start messing with the function of ZBTB20, we might mess with a lot more than the astrocytes that could lead us down a road that we don't want to go down. But this question I'm often asked, well, if there are genetic causes of stuttering, what about gene therapy? And gene therapy is now being used. I will just say gene therapy for stuttering is probably a very long way off. And the reason why is because there are continued difficulties with toxicity of gene therapy. There have been a few notable successes for gene therapy, but there have also been some notable toxic events with gene therapy. Just recently, a disease I think called myotubular myopathy. They did gene therapy and it was a big problem for the 2 people who received the treatment. And plus it's very, very, very expensive. And I think it's probably unlikely to be reimbursed by, gene therapy is unlikely to be reimbursed by any health insurance company because it's considered experimental. And so gene therapy is potentially way out there on the horizon, someplace far out there, but it's probably not practical to think about today.
So one of the things that we always talk about is that 1 in 100 people, generally speaking, stutter. But there's a time during development, adolescence, where that number is considerably higher, and then some 80% of those people kind of leave the stuttering behind them and move on to more fluent speech. How does the research that you've done allow for that change? Is the brain just reworking itself and those genes are still there, or is it something different?
Well, you're right. It probably is the brain just reworking itself, and the genes are still there. This is an interesting point. I think you've touched upon something called persistent stuttering. I just say, in our lab, we have only studied persistent stuttering. Okay, the classic, what's called persistent developmental stuttering. I personally think that who persists and who recovers from stuttering is maybe the most interesting scientific question about the disorder. Genetics does not provide an easy entree into that problem. We've thought about this for a long time, and we have yet to come up with a good idea. So as far as persistence versus recovery, it's a very important question, but not one we've been able to address. I will say, maybe a little bit cynically, I guess, as the parent of 2 twin boys who both stuttered, while childhood developmental stuttering may be hair-raising for us parents who've gone through it, if it goes through the normal course of recovery, it's not a problem. It just isn't. My 2 sons, they were 3 years old. They don't even remember they ever stuttered, and they're perfectly fluent now. So the problem is the persistent stuttering. And that's what our research efforts have always focused on.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that tuned in and to all the questions you raised. To Dr. Drayna, thank you for your time today. I think it was time well spent on a topic we know has always been a hot topic in our community. And for Jane, thank you for everything the Stuttering Foundation does and will continue to do. After this is completed, this session we're having today is completed, it will be stored as a video for posterity on our Facebook site. So if there are others that our audience would like to share this with, please do that. Please check back in and point those people to the event today. And, this is our second Facebook Live, Jane. I think it's gone pretty well the last 2 times.
Thank you all.
Some more.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.